Tonight we are very honored to have the authors of the featured book tonight, Revised and Enhanced Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, compared with the Earliest Known Manuscripts. We've got Alonzo Gaskill here. He has written, like as most of you heard, over 24 books. Has a long history of teaching in the church educational system, and most recently at BYU. And Richard Moore has also had a long career in the church educational system. And we appreciate them being here tonight. With that, I will turn the time over to the authors to present to us, and then we'll do some question and answers after, and appreciate you being here.
There you go. I'm going to start because if I don't say something now, I usually don't get to say anything. Alonzo and I have been friends for years and years, and people usually think I deserve a medal for that, just because he's hard to be friends with sometimes. About 10 years ago, I retired, and shortly after that, he called me up and said, I'm working on a book. He said, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith is now out of print, and they're telling us here at BYU not to use it anymore when we're writing, in our writing, whether we're doing articles or books or whatever, because of the Joseph Smith papers. He said that he wanted to go through teachings and in the one column have teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, just like it was published in 1938 and on. And in the right-hand column, have the most, the earliest version of it unedited. And so it would be easy to find, especially if you're, if you were raised like some of us were with teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and we're so familiar with it. I remember a class I took at BYU where the religion professor said he considered teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith the fifth standard work. I didn't know it was that important to but he thought it really was. So I said, well, that's interesting. I hope you have enjoy that. And he said, would you be willing to do some research? Because he says, I've had some student helpers and they can't seem to find some things. And he gave me an example of a few things they couldn't find. I'm saying, well, that's not that tough to find. I mean, really, go to the library. Online, you can find this stuff. So I started helping. I actually got hired to be an adjunct researcher for the next 3 years, being paid to do the research for part of the book, and then ran out of funds. And he just said, would you be willing to stay on? And yeah, I like to see it through. So I stayed on. That was about 7 years ago. And we just, it took us about 10 years to get it done, but we finished it, and I'm happy to get it published. And think we hope it's a valuable tool. It was never designed to replace, the Joseph Smith papers, of course. That's 20-something volumes of stuff. But it was really for the people who enjoyed teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith and still used it and still knew where quotes were in it. And so this way remembering that, they could go to their teachings, know what page they're looking for, find it in our book, and then find where it is, whether it be in the Joseph Smith papers or Wilford Woodruff journals or other journals or other letters or in the church history library. It just becomes a way to find things from teachings a lot easier. You want to take it?
That was it, huh? Wow.
I'm done, yeah.
Touching.
I don't say much.
Oh, yes you do.
Do you want to have this?
I guess so.
All right.
Thank you. Color there. Rich's 18-year-old granddaughter said the other day she wants to take the two of us out to dinner to just listen to old people banter. So we tend to do a bit of that. Thanks for taking the time to be here. I know this is not a very sexy topic, but grateful that you're willing to spend a little bit of time with us. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? So the thing I just wanted to talk about was a little bit about kind of what we discovered. We've been asked several times, what was the big revelation? You know, what did you discover doing this? And both of us initially had not the answer that most people predicted, and that was, we came out with quite a bit of awe for Joseph Fielding Smith. Just the idea that a guy in an era before computers could know these documents the way he knew them. And find these, and you know, there were challenges trying to find stuff that is digitized. And yet Joseph Fielding Smith, for all of the criticism people level against he and McConkie and some of those brethren who were so prolific, really was remarkable. And I think that was more shocking than some of the things we found that read a little bit differently than in teachings. I really gained additional respect for him. When I converted to the church in college, I glommed on pretty quickly to Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, because if you had a question, they said something about it. And when I had spent a little time writing college curriculum and been on the church's correlation committee, you know, it had gotten to a point where it had been far enough in the past that they encouraged you to try and find somebody more recent to quote, understandably. But the problem is, a lot of times, some of those early general authorities, even 20th century general authorities, talked a lot more on doctrine, gave a lot more of that kind of stuff. And so it made it a little bit challenging sometimes to find a good quote on something, because Bruce R. McConkie or Joseph Fielding Smith were easy go-tos for just about anything. What I thought I'd do was just share a few things that struck me between the difference in how the original teachings reads and what we found as being different in the earliest manuscripts. So I'll just throw out a few of these. I've got pages and pages, it's not worth the time. But to kind of just give you a sense of some of the things that are different. And, you know, some of these were editors when they were compiling the original history of the church. Some of them were Joseph Fielding Smith. Some of them for the sake of fleshing out what those who were present knew had been said, even though it didn't get recorded. Other times they were taking something that was a pretty cryptic statement and just trying to give it a little bit more meaning. And so, for example, from the original teachings, it is a desirable honor that you should so walk before our Heavenly Father as to save yourselves. We are all responsible to God for the manner we improve the light and wisdom given by the Lord to enable us to save ourselves. That quote was really crafted from a much shorter statement that simply said, it is an honor to save yourselves. All are responsible to save themselves. And what it appears the editors were looking at was, you got a statement by Joseph Smith that seems to cut God and Jesus out of it, very works-based. And while certainly they retain that idea, they kind of nuance it a bit to help you to see that your duty to save yourself is through doing the things God is asking you to do, rather than somehow, you know, cutting Jesus out of the equation. And so you can see why they kind of fleshed it out. But if you were to just take what was recorded of Joseph's statement, it certainly doesn't articulate that additional layer or idea. And part of, I think, the challenge that we saw was, in the early era there, well before Nauvoo, you often only had one person that recorded something Joseph said. Whereas by Nauvoo, multiple people were writing down what he was saying. And so there were a lot less challenging statements in the 1840s than in the 1830s because of multiple people's records. Here's a curious one. The original statement, Abraham says, Melchizedek, away. I have a priesthood. That's the entire statement. Abram says, Melchizedek, away, I have a priesthood. From that, the original teachings gave us, Abraham says to Melchizedek, I believe all that thou hast taught me concerning the priesthood and the coming of the Son of Man. So Melchizedek ordained Abraham and sent him away, Abraham rejoicing, saying, now I have a priesthood. So a pretty cryptic comment that could be read, get out of here, man, I got one. Or, okay, I got one, you can go now. Clarified quite a bit by the editors. Let me just jump ahead to see. In Joseph's teaching on theosis or divinization, he makes a comment. He says, God that sits enthroned is a man, like one of yourselves. if you were to see him today, you would see him in the very form of a man. That gets nuanced a bit because it appears that what they're seeing in this is Joseph not saying he's like a man or he's in the form of a man, but as it was recorded, he is a man, the very form of a man. And so the way it's nuanced in the original teachings, God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man. And if you were to see him today, you would see him like a man in form. And so the concept of just as it was recorded anyway, when nobody's there to know what Joseph really said, but the way it was worded in the notes, he is a man, nuanced to suggest now he's like a man or in the form of a man, or we in that form. Here's also a curious one. Joseph gives a discourse in which he says, I am dwelling in this discourse on the immutability of the spirit of man, that God is immutable. It gets changed in teachings to, I am dwelling on the immortality of the spirit of man. That's a small thing, but his immutability is this idea that he's unchangeable in nature. His immortality, that he has no beginning, no end, that he's undying per se. And so for whatever reason, that word was replaced, changed, given a very different kind of interpretation. You also have some material that in various discourses, when teachings was compiled, Joseph Fielding Smith just chose to get rid of. I'm just going to cut that part out of the discourse, put some ellipses. Interestingly enough, a former student of mine, sent me a clip of a girl from BYU complaining the other day. It was something he had found on, I don't know where online, but she was basically saying, oh, my biology professor, oh my gosh, he's explaining dinosaurs by saying that this earth may have been created using pre-existing matter, and some of those things were left over. And when I heard her say it, I thought, well, I know what your biology professor is talking about, actually. Because in a discourse by Joseph Fielding Smith cuts out this statement. This earth was organized or formed out of other planets which were broke up and remodeled and made into this one on which we live. I don't know why Joseph Fielding Smith got rid of it. Maybe he disagreed with it. But the interesting thing was clearly the biology professor at BYU was quoting this very statement. And the girl had not heard of it and felt like her biology professor was way out there. I don't know if he had not attributed to Joseph Smith or what the deal was. Here's another one that I thought was curious. Joseph Fielding Smith cut this out. But Joseph said, the remission of sins by baptism is not to be preached to murderers. So apparently Joseph felt like if you murdered somebody, you were done. I would have thought President Smith would have liked that, just because that was an era where we were a lot more black and white, but for whatever reason, that one got nixed. There's a section where Joseph Fielding Smith simply says this, or this is what he puts in teachings. On the 21st day of January 1836, the First Presidency and a number of the presiding brethren in the church assembled in the Kirtland Temple, where they engaged in the ordinances of the endowment as far as it had been revealed at the time. In the original notes of that, it actually goes through this washing, anointing, putting oil in the hand, putting it on the individual. And so Joseph Fielding Smith, perhaps because of the sensitive nature of it at the time, chose not to include that, but just give a summarial statement of what they did instead. So you've got a lot of these kinds of things that are interesting. Here's another one that got deleted, perhaps just because of its kind of odd or graphic nature. March 20th, Sunday sermon by Joseph the Seer. A large assembly of saints gathered together at an early hour to hear a discourse delivered upon the subject of baptism by Joseph the Seer. But then this next line gets cut out in Joseph Fielding Smith's original version, where it says, a young child was dead and his corpse was present in the assembly. That called forth many remarks from the speaker upon death and resurrection. And then he goes on to talk about what Joseph said. I don't know if it just seemed odd to say, and so there was a dead body of a kid in the congregation. And that made Joseph say, hey, whose dead kid is this? I think I'll talk about that. And so he cuts that out. I don't know that that's why he removed it. It's probably why I would take it out. I'm just looking here because there's so many of these, forgive me.
Do the rough stone rolling.
Oh, thank you, Rich. Yeah. So, should I give him what Joseph Fielding Smith said before I give the quote from Joseph?
No, do the other quote, do the quote first. I mean, no, do the Joseph Fielding Smith one first, yeah.
Thank you. Ignore the man behind the curtain. You'll be familiar with this discourse, right? I am like a huge rough stone rolling down a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else. Striking with accelerated force against religious bigotry, priestcraft, lawyercraft, doctorcraft, lying editors, judges and jurors, and the authority of perjured executives backed by mobs, blasphemers, licentious and corrupt men and women, all hell knocking off a corner here and a corner there. Thus I will become a smooth and polished shaft in the quiver of the Almighty, who will give me dominion over all and every one of them, when their refuge of lies shall fail, and their hiding place shall be destroyed, while these smooth polished stones with which I come in contact become marred, close quote. Well, that beautiful statement that we often quote is drawn from this one original comment, quote, rough stone rolling downhill, close quote.
That's it?
That's it. So 5 words turned into a rather long and eloquent paragraph. Now, here's what I think happened, and Rich, correct me if you disagree with this, so they'll know that you don't know what you're talking about. Thanks for the Kirsty laugh. I'm pretty convinced that those who knew Joseph heard him teach this, because at one point, Brigham Young gives a discourse, and he says most of this in the discourse. And refers to Joseph as a rough stone rolling, and goes through a lot of the elements with, striking off a corner here, striking off a corner there. I think what happens is they see that 5-word note, rough stone rolling downhill, and they not only remember the discourse, but have access to Brigham's discourse on it that gets written out by George Watt, I think it was. And so as a consequence, they seem to have adopted an awful lot of Brigham Young's description of it, and just turned it into first person as though it was Joseph himself. That was common practice back then. Today we would say you can't do that. But back then that kind of a thing was very, very common. And so I'm not in any way being critical of that. But when you and I think in terms of Joseph once said, Rich and I have gotten to the point where we will say, there's a quote attributed to Joseph Smith. And we almost never now will say Joseph Smith said. Not only because, we didn't have people like Watt, George Watt with his shorthand recording things word for word. But in cases like this with the rough stone rolling quote, you've got 5 words that are attributed to Joseph, and then all this additional stuff that's been placed around it. Again, I think largely drawing on Brigham Young's discourse, and so as a consequence, you can't really say Joseph said all of that. Certainly no one wrote it down at the time, so far as we could find. Well, I'm rambling here. Those are the kinds of things we ran across. Earth-shattering? No. But there are a lot of things that I think editors either tried to fill in some cases remove, and in other cases even clarify. At one point, Joseph is talking about keys, and he's kind of vague in how he's talking about it. And so the editors are very careful to kind of flesh out what that means. And the keys of the priesthood, and this being given to the church, and things like that. Not because they're trying to be dishonest, but clearly because they're concerned that people might misunderstand or misread, and so they make an effort to be pretty clear on that, just to kind of clarify so there isn't any misunderstanding. Okay, with that in mind, should we do a few questions? Sure. Okay, so yeah, please.
Yeah. So when you say they, the editors embellished these, you're saying that's Joseph Fielding Smith
Well, no.
doing this in 1938.
Not completely. Well, you said.
Yeah, I think a lot of it were the early historians who were compiling the history, beginning in Nauvoo, and then when they had to come here to Utah, after they got here, some of the early historians were, working on the history, and I think many of them knew Joseph, of course, and so we're familiar with maybe what he said, or maybe were even there when he said it, but they're the ones who compiled the history, not so much. I don't think Joseph Fielding Smith did much changing in it. The thing, somebody asked me, do you think Joseph Fielding Smith's doctrinal ideas influenced his the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith? What I see is what he picked and chose to put in or not to put in is how he would have done that. But most of this, when he talks about the editors, we're talking the early historians.
So these are just the things he saw. in 1938 and just picked
Yeah,
and then edited.
Well, okay, so some cases he does, but George A. Smith and others in the historian's office, after Joseph is dead, send out a letter in essence saying, look, if you've got anything, an experience you had, something you heard Joseph say, something you wrote down, drop by, drop it off, we want to get everything we can. And so they collect all of these things, and they start then trying to flesh out the history of the church, content of Joseph's teachings that they're going to put in the history and things like that based on what was available to them. So Joseph Fielding Smith has access to all of these original documents, but he also has access to those original compilations that the editors have already filled out. So in some cases, Joseph Fielding Smith is clarifying things. In some cases, he's saying, I don't want to include the thing about a dead kid sitting in the audience. But in many cases, he's taking things that 19th century editors had already fleshed out based on lots of different people's recollections, some of that being completely oral tradition, or, I was there and heard, or my mother told me about how Joseph such and such. And so they had created as much as they could and recorded as much as they could of first-hand and second-hand accounts. And Joseph Fielding Smith then is looking at a lot of that. But I think Rich is right. You don't get the impression he's going through and saying, ooh, let's tweak this to say what I wanted to say. Instead, I think what you see him doing is saying, I'm not going to talk about that there, that doesn't really matter to me. I think this is an important principle, I'll include that in teachings.
and he did write the headings,
Yeah.
so,
And the other thing that I think, when we were going through this, obviously not all of this is in the Joseph Smith papers. So we're drawing from a lot of different sources, and we're trying to go back to the earliest. And you could say, well, if you'd gone one generation later, it's a more fleshed out quote. Yeah, it is fleshed out. So we tried to just be careful about saying, let's get back to the earliest thing we could possibly find that hasn't had editorial fingerprints on it. Again, we weren't trying to prove anything, but like Rich, I converted, not like Rich, converted in college, and I was just in awe, first of the Doctrine and Covenants, then the Book of Mormon. And then when I discovered Teachings of Prophet Joseph Smith, that just was so fascinating to me. And like Rich's college professor, my mission president had said, he had taught at BYU for 16 years, he said, if I were to do it all over again, I would stick with the standard works and the Teachings of Prophet Joseph Smith. And I was like, okay, that didn't turn out to be my philosophy. But I had read this so many times and had these quotes that I often would just draw out when the subject came up, that for me, this being taken away and that you couldn't quote it anymore, I was like, oh my gosh. And I found the challenge of, well, what if you don't own the Joseph Smith papers and all those volumes? And often having the difficulty of finding quotes. And so I was really more interested not in necessarily publishing a book or another book, but simply saying, I need to have this. I need all of those original statements and what he really said so that I'm quoting him accurately, and as a consequence, this thing kind of just grew out of that.
what?
He's got his hand up.
Oh,
Did Robert's documentary history come out before the Teachings of the Prophet, or is that one of the sources he gleaned
Yeah.
from?
yes, it came out before.
So that would have been one of the sources he gleaned from.
Let's see, when did that, wait a second, the comprehensive or the
So
earlier one
History of
came?
the Church comes out before.
Right.
Volume 7.
Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Published in 1932.
Yeah.
Okay.
6 years.
Just prior to that.
Yeah. I found it, I'm gonna say something that's not a question, or I'm just gonna say. The research was interesting. One of the things that I thought there would be, like I said before, would be mainly Joseph Smith papers, but there were so many other things in other places that we had to find. But my favorite experience was when I was reading through it, and it said the Proverbs, I believe, the Proverbs of Joseph Smith. And that was in teachings, and so I went to Joseph Smith papers, it wasn't there. I went to other places, it wasn't there. And so I wrote an email to the church history library, because they'll research for you, I really appreciate that, and say, I'm trying to find this. I waited a couple of weeks and got an email back, we can't find it. We've sent people looking for it, we can't find it. So then I told Alonzo they couldn't find it. He goes, well, I'm going to write to him as well. I won't mention that you said that you had more clout.
Yeah. Don't say that.
I won't.
Thank you.
And so he wrote to him and said, can you find this? And they wrote back and said, we can't find it. No one can find it. We've looked again. And so then he asked one of the librarians over at BYU Library to ask the same question. And so he wrote in and asked, can you find this for us? And they wrote back to him and said, we can't find it. And I knew one of the church historians at the time, was a kind of an acquaintance of mine. So I actually called him and said, what about this? What about these Proverbs of Joseph Smith? And he said, man, there's a lot of people looking for that right now. It was just us. But he said, yeah, they found it. I go, what? He goes, yeah, they found it. And he sent me the email, and it was just one piece of paper in the archives. A guy by the name of Erastus Derby had written down these things that he'd heard Joseph Smith say. And so that was one of my most pleasing moments in the research process, is to find that one little sheet. Okay, other questions? Yes?
Are there any significant discourses or teachings from Joseph Smith that, through your research, you might feel were, I guess, just not included in the teachings?
Oh, there are a lot of things that were not included. That's why the Joseph Smith papers are out there. Let me go on a different note here. There are some things included in teachings that were published in the Times and Seasons when Joseph Smith was the editor of the Times and Seasons, and it was an editorial. And so I think Joseph Fielding Smith assumed, well, it's an editorial. Joseph Smith was the editor. He must have written it. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm saying, as I read through those, I don't know. I don't know whether he wrote it and had somebody punch it up for him, like John Taylor or W.W. Phelps. I don't know whether he asked them to write it and then read through it and approved it. Or maybe he just wrote it. I don't know. But we included it, but I think we had footnotes saying, we're not really sure whether he actually wrote this or not. But the fact that he was the editor, maybe he did. The fact that he was the editor and it was in the paper, maybe he approved it, and then it would still be okay. Yes?
Some of the examples that have been given are kind of a short thing made longer, more expounded. Is there anything that maybe you saw that was massaged to be more in line with the current teachings compared to teachings that were earlier?
You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it goes back to, it did not feel to me that Joseph Fielding Smith was trying to manipulate the doctrine or make Joseph say something that the church was currently believing. As far as we can tell, most of what he's doing is simply picking stuff that he feels like agrees with the teachings of the church. I gave that example of the dinosaur thing with, I don't know why he got rid of it. It seems like it would have been something that would have been useful or curious or interesting, but it really doesn't feel like he's trying to manipulate or change these quotes to say what he wants them to say to align with the doctrine. He may have found some things by Joseph that he didn't agree with that he chose not to include, but that would be much more likely than him changing them, because as we went back, for the most part, he's just basically saying, okay, that's clearly what this is about. If you want to talk about the example we used with priesthood and priesthood keys, where it gets fleshed out a bit, I don't think that it's not evident in the comment that's what's being said, but it's cryptic enough that you could see somebody interpreting it differently.
So no notes to show motivation on anything?
Yeah, I didn't see any evidence of anything nefarious or motivation to be deceptive. I think he picked things that he really believed were important and impactful. I'm sure he ignored things that weren't. He cut out things that, for whatever reason, he didn't think were helpful in a given discourse. But no, he seems to have been very honest about what he was doing. And both he and the editors, I think, because of the era, felt very comfortable having a secondhand comment about something and taking it and turning it into first person, because that was just commonplace, right? But it has, I will say this, that's caused us problems. We have things in the 7-volume history of the church that are attributed to Joseph Smith. And the anti-Mormons have come out since, and I'm not trying to be pejorative in saying that, but those who are not fans of us have come out and said, Kinderhook, or Zelf, or, all these things. And then you go back and find the original statement, you realize, that wasn't actually Joseph after all. But because those things were put as first person in the history of the church, now we're saying, oh, never mind, we didn't really mean that. And again, they weren't doing anything that would have been uncommon in their day, but today people look at that and say, you claimed for 100 years it was, Joseph, why is it not now? Because it's not convenient. And the truth is, we know, we've been able to go through and, the provenance of where some of these came from, but nobody's interested in that. And so that tendency back then has ultimately caused some problems, I think, for the church in things that were attributed to Joseph that he just simply didn't say, or we have no record of him saying, and it was somebody else. Oliver B. Huntington and Moon Men, being a good example of that.
Yeah. I want to go back to, hang on to what you were asking about. Are there things that were left out of the, that he could have included in teachings? I think there's tons of things left out. The example I'll
About
give,
22 volumes.
yeah, but the example I'll give is from the King Follett sermon, the King Follett Discourse. So there are 4 guys who were writing down notes from that, either right there at the time or when they got home trying to remember. You put them all together in this amalgamation into the King Follett sermon, and you can read the whole thing in 20 minutes. They said that he spoke for over 2 hours. So my question is, what else was being said, and why did they miss that? And so, in my mind, as I read through there, I wish that George Watt, and even though his stuff is questionable now, they're finding out that some of his shorthand is maybe a little questionable, but he was baptized in England, and the new Pitman shorthand came to Nauvoo in 1842, but we have no record of him writing anybody's sermons down until 1845. That's the first known one we have. And so whether he wrote down any of Joseph's sermons or not, we just don't know. I wish he had. I wish he'd been there for the King Follett thing, and I think we would have had a more expanded version of it.
Was there an attempt to access the Joseph Fielding Smith papers to see if there's any correspondence that would explain methodology, working papers, where marks were made, that sort of thing?
Well,
Sure, thanks for bringing that up.
yeah. Well, not his papers or correspondence. We did go back and look at original documents from which the transcriptions were created. We had a couple of places, not a lot, but a couple of places where the people who had transcribed these, Joseph Smith papers, for example, interpreted a word differently than the 2 of us and thought, yeah, we don't read it that way. But because the goal was ultimately just to go back and find the earliest statements, we didn't go and see if Joseph Fielding Smith had corresponded with people about, because he really didn't seem to be, at least so far as we could tell, trying to do anything other than find the best collection he could of Joseph's statements.
When did it go out of print?
How long has it been? Do you guys know when they took teachings out of
Well,
print?
it's still in print and paperback, so I'm not aware of it going out.
Oh.
They told us we couldn't use it anymore for writing, publishing, things like that. Maybe 10, 12 years ago, I don't remember. It's been a while. The first thing I saw was at the RSC saying, don't quote it in anything. And then Desert Book did the same thing. And then it pretty much just became, don't go there for these issues.
Any other questions? Yes?
As you go back to his original words, is there any sense of Joseph's personality or who he really was, as opposed to what things have later been attributed to him that struck you as surprising or noteworthy in any way? Was there any revelation of the man underneath all of that?
Yes, we're ready to answer that. Alonzo?
Actually, Christian, it was probably the opposite, meaning because we saw how many things were very cryptic,
Yeah.
Rich and I both came to kind of the realization that we know less than we thought we did of what Joseph said, how he said it. There are a number of discourses by Joseph, like Things in the Times and Seasons, that use Latin phrases and terms that are not original. W.W. Phelps was really into that. Our suspicion is that Joseph may have said, taught something, Phelps wrote it up, Joseph approved it, Phelps had put his flair on it. The thing that I think we came out of is we shouldn't be dogmatic about things attributed to Joseph Smith. I remember as a new convert finding something in teachings and saying, notice the word Joseph picked here. Ooh, and now I'm like, I have no idea who said that. Go back and see who wrote it. But it was less, Christian, the ability to kind of get a sense of his persona or personality, and more kind of this sense of, some of what we've attributed to him over the years in personality and persona is actually coming from other people who either recorded, told the story, wrote it out, and we just really know a lot less than we thought. So yeah, it's almost the opposite.
And there's some frustration in that for me. The more I studied him, I came away feeling dumber, you know. Will you hand me that paper, please? I just want to talk about one of the things we did, because I know some people said, well, you just cut and paste from the Joseph Smith papers. First of all, we didn't get everything from the Joseph Smith papers. Secondly, there was some cutting and pasting from before the books were out, but I just want to make sure you understand what took place in his office for hours and hours and days and days. He sat at a computer with our transcript. I had the Joseph Smith Papers book, and I would read while he would follow along like this. Capital although, A-L-T-H-O apostrophe, I do wrong, comma, I do not wrongs that I am charged, C-H-A-R-G apostrophe D with doing, dash, space. The wrong that I do is through T-H-R-O apostrophe, the frailty of human nature like other men, period. Capital no man lives without fault, period. Capital do you think that even capital Jesus, comma, if he were here, would be without fault in your eyes, question mark. Capital they, T-H bracketed E-Y, said all manner of evil against him, dash, space. They all watched, W-A-T-C-H apostrophe D for iniquity, period. We went through the whole thing like that.
More than once.
Do you know how hard it is to... I got pretty good at reading with all the punctuation, capitalization. It was... But we spent...
Which one of you was looking in the hat, though?
Oh, that was me. That was me. Yeah. He was wearing it while I was looking into it, which was awkward. But
That was a nightmare for a while. The only thing I enjoyed is when he would have to leave for a little while and I would eat the cashews and candy he had sitting there while he was sitting there. You know about that. Any other questions?
thank you.
He's
Thank
got
you
a question.
very
He's got a
much.
question.
I'll talk to you after.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.